Hi, and welcome to the Dish on Divorce. I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And I'm Leanne Townsend.
And today in the studio, we have Rob Laidlaw, Canadian musician. Unfortunately, Leanne's on Zoom tonight, so bear with us if we interrupt each other a little bit, because this is a little new. We're used to being in the studio together. I want to start out this show by saying congratulations to my co-host, Leanne, because her podcast, Divorcing Well, which you should all follow, has reached 15,000 downloads. So, Leanne, congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So, Rob, as I said, is a Canadian musician. Rob, who have you played with?
Well, I've played with, actually, just before we started the podcast, Leanne asked me about a band that I spent a good part of the last decade performing with, Platinum Blonde. And I have a long history with that band, but I've pretty much touched down over the years. I'm what you would consider a journeyman. I've played with, so I'm in the era that I was sort of maturing as a musician in, were the 80s. So pretty much any of the 80s bands that you would have come across, Honeymoon Suite, Platinum Blonde, Helix, Kim Mitchell, Lana Miles. Yeah, I mean the list is rough. I mean the list is quite vast, yeah. So sort of through the end of the '80s into all through the '90s, I was touring. I was a journeyman touring with all whatever. Basically, after I acquired the Kim Mitchell gig. I went from having to audition for jobs to just being called for jobs, right? So Kim, and it was actually your husband, Jen, that was asking me the first concert I ever went to, and the first concert I ever went to was the band Rush. And growing up in Canada, Rush and Max Webster, which was Kim Mitchell's band, were the two sort of biggest bands out there, and so yeah, and just in terms of, not only in terms of status, but in terms of musicianship. So if you were if you played in Kim Mitchell's band, you were sort of at the top of your game. And yeah, so after that, acquiring that job, I was well on my way to becoming entrenched in the Canadian music industry as a side man, as well as having other assets as well, songwriting and producing and everything else. But in terms of a working journeyman, that was the defining gig that opened so many doors for me. Yeah.
Impressive resume.
What instrument do you play?
Play the bass guitar, which is the 4-string guitar, primarily the rhythm section portion of the band. But I mean, I also am a proficient 6-string guitar. So that's the lead guitar and keyboards, and I do drum programming. And yeah, so I primarily write on the 6-string guitar, though. Yeah.
It's amazing.
So Rob, I asked you to come on the show because you've gone through your own divorce.
Mm-hmm.
You married young. How long were you married?
27 years.
What happened?
Well. So I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober coming in to July. July 11th is my sober birthday. 6 years. So you'll find there's a common thread amongst most alcoholics, and that is a pattern of starting drinking in your teens. And that certainly was the case in my scenario. And sort of as a young teenager, I'd already become proficient playing the guitar and started playing in bands. And unfortunately, I'm not saying that the entertainment industry is exclusive to addiction. I think humankind is exclusive to addiction. I think one of the things that we're all kind of addicted to is the device that we're, talking to Leanne on. Well, the computer, really. Anyway, my addiction to alcohol sort of started in my mid-teens, and by the time I was like late teens, early 20s, I was entrenched in the music industry, and it definitely lends itself to late nights, opportunity to consume alcohol specifically, and then other substances as well. But by the time I sort of entered the professional field of the music industry, I would be categorized as an alcoholic straight up. And my father, who was a psychiatrist and actually the head of psychiatry at the East General here in Toronto, was also an alcoholic, and he died of alcoholism. So they always say, I'm also sort of a big proponent, of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's been very helpful resource for me in my recovery. And in this format, actually, Leanne, the Zoom scenario. There's also often a saying that you shake any family tree and alkies fall out. Well, in my case, my father, I sort of grew up with that, and he was, and again, another phrase that they talk about a lot is high functioning alcoholism, which I think is, is kind of a ironic slogan, because quite simply, if you ask any family member about the functionality of their alcoholic individual in the family, they'll say anything but that they're high functioning. Sadly, my father really, in the end, it was the alcoholism and subsequent drug abuse, and not the greasy drugs that we, the boutique drugs like cocaine and all those things. It was prescription drugs, which doctors notoriously self-prescribe. That was, I would say, a major contributing factor to the demise of my marriage. Yeah. The fact that, you know what, and it's interesting because I've done quite a few podcasts talking about addiction in the last few years. And, one of the things that I identified and have identified over the years in sobriety is the source of why I started drinking. And at the end of the day, I didn't really like myself that much, truly. So, yet we all wear these masks, right, to function, every day. I mean, and we all have very active lives. And certainly when I was working, performing in all kinds of different bands, traveling all over the place, very active, but feeling quite broken and lost some days, right? So, I mean, look where we are right now in this pandemic. I mean, we live in a environment of daily uncertainty, right? So it's interesting. I was talking to my girlfriend just on the way down, and we were talking about how it's kind of leveled the playing field, just from on a humanity perspective, but in many regards, it's thrown us into this scenario of all collectively being uncertain of what the heck is coming next, and even in terms of the rules and the things that we're expected to absorb. But thankfully, I haven't had the compulsion to drink, and I've had some pretty. I've always said, sobering up certainly hasn't been a front row seat to the good life, but it's certainly enabled me to contend with life a whole lot better, at least where I sit today.
Addiction is such an important topic to talk about in the context of separation and divorce, because I know, I see it happening with a lot of clients, and I personally went through a period myself after my divorce where I started drinking heavily. And so a lot of people, when they're going through the pain of, divorce, they self-medicate, and alcohol, just like with COVID, we're hearing that alcohol consumption for a lot of people has gone up. Divorce is also a time where, people who maybe had a problem with alcohol before, it becomes even worse, or people like myself who I didn't have a problem with alcohol at all during my marriage or through most of my life. But when we separated, and, I had a bunch of other things happening to me at the same time, I found myself seeking, solace in a bottle as well. And it's a very slippery slope that I think people can fall into.
Yeah, I would agree with that implicitly. I've seen, so as I say, I'm quite active in Zoom AA. I go to at least 3 meetings a week. And I've seen a lot of people relapse in this specific time. And I've actually seen, surprisingly, a lot of people come in too. Believe it or not, the anonymity in the AA moniker is a little easier in this world, in the Zoom world, right? For one thing, you can enter a meeting without the camera on, so you're truly anonymous, right? And your mic is muted, so you can just literally go in and I think the most remarkable thing is that I've found is that you can literally go to meetings all over the globe. So sort of my home group is a group that's based out of downtown Toronto. But I'd say in the Zoom world in the last year and a half, we have literally, I'd say 80% of the participants in this group are from the US and with a smattering of UK and Ireland. And so it's been an opportunity to, globally meet people who have the same brain deficiency as I do, right? And yeah, I mean, I think it's there's all kinds of ways we cope with stress and anxiety. I mean, it's always a funny thing. People will often ask me, well, how do you cope with anxiety? And it's like, you know what? I mean, I think the question, to me, that's kind of the wrong question. The question is, how are we not anxious every moment of the day? And certainly in this environment we're living in right now. So, you know what? I mean, I've found, ironically, the notion of social drinking, which is often bandied around, right? Oh, you can have one drink and everything else. For me, as a drinker, it lost the social element, or even the element of placating my anxiety and my worry and stress years ago. And I would say probably in my early 20s, like it became a way for me to cope with my own inner insecurities and inner, lack of awareness of who the heck I was too, right? And I was always a pretty voracious reader, but as I got busier in, say, touring, like I'd say all through the 90s, I was pretty much touring all over the world. And I just, again, we tend to do what's easiest, as people. Like we'll take the, I mean, if it's easier to just, have a couple of drinks and it takes the edge off. That's another common phrase we hear too, right? You find that, after a month of that, it's problematic, right? Like you're having a harder time getting up in the morning. And I'll tell you, there's another AA slogan. There's not a morning I've woken up in sobriety wishing I had been drinking last night, kind of thing, right? Like, I mean, when you start to drink more, it literally affects every aspect of your physiology, right? And ironically, alcohol is a depressant. So we sort of drink, to forget, only to be haunted by the things that we're technically running away from. So I've always, or at least I've come to the awareness that as painful as confronting certain things may be, if you look at it straight head on, you will push through to the other side. Yeah, I mean, let's face it, life is a struggle at the best of times, right? It really is. I'm not being nihilistic or anything. It's just what I've observed, right? And if we can find pockets of happiness and also identify what that means to you too, right? But I definitely know that, you know, when I look back on the impact that my father had on my life and the way he contended with, and this is a guy that helped hundreds of people, like his patients, right? And conversely, thousands of people, right, by association. And he was clinically depressed, sort of never contended with. And, you know, by the time he had reached my age, he had literally turned to dealing with his anxiety, his depression by drinking. And it was a spiral into, well, just physically completely degenerating. And then by the time he did have some real health issues, it was kind of too late. So that's the sad reality of any, you know, sort of real problem. And you know what I mean? Look at the reality of where we live today. You know, we've got Gamblers Anonymous, we've got you know, shopaholics, we've got sexaholics, we've got, you know, CA, which is cocaine. I mean, literally, we lean towards addiction in our culture, right? So whatever that may look like, there are certain addictions, sadly, that will, just physiologically, that storm will wipe you out if you don't contend with it. So, and in my case, I started having seizures. So it was like the head saying to the body, this thing between you two is over. If you don't smarten up, ultimately, you will, you know, you won't get up again. And I mean, one of the seizures, the singer from Platinum Blonde held me through it, right? Like, I mean, I don't recall any of the you know, the actual act, the physical reaction of it, but I'll tell you that my last seizure was 6 years ago, this July 11th, on my mom's memorial, and I was standing up to deliver a eulogy, and I plowed through the chairs and started flopping around on the ground like a fish, and went to the hospital, and the doctor looked at my chart and looked at me, and he said, "You're drinking a lot, aren't you, Rob?" And I sort of said, "Oh, no, not so much." He goes, "You're probably doing drugs too." And I said, "Oh, definitely not." And you know, he could tell by, you know, it was my third seizure in a few years, all caused by the same thing, ironically, alcohol withdrawal. But it's the blood sugar in the booze that literally, if your body doesn't receive it every day, you go into shock, right? And then subsequently you have a seizure. And he literally looked at me and my chart and threw the chart down on my bed and said, "You're not going to live into your 50s. Have a great day," and walked away.
Wow.
So that was sort of, alcoholics often talk about an aha moment, and that was it. And, you know, both my sisters kind of said that was Mom's last action on this earth. You were either coming with her or you were going to straighten up and get your act together. So whether or not that sort of spiritual reality happened in that moment, I certainly couldn't look the other way, because everything in my life was being torn away from me. My relationship with my ex-wife was all but over. I had a tenuous relationship with both my children. Yeah, I mean, I had to make, you know, as I said, I couldn't look the other way. And I'd also spent a good 3 decades living a certain way, and it clearly wasn't working. So that was probably the biggest epiphany I had in that, you know, sitting on the gurney yet again, and hadn't injured myself that time. But I mean, any one of the seizures, I could have been driving, I could have killed someone, I could have killed, you know. So part of that was just being aware of the fact that literally, even though drinking often is a social event, when you're a problematic drinker and or alcoholic, you sink into an isolation, this abyss of aloneness. Yeah, I mean, it's unparalleled in terms of how I could describe it, except to say, with the absence of that in my life, and any substance too, because I was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day when I quit. I was, I wasn't problematically abusing cocaine, but I was, enough, and primarily the alcohol and the tobacco. But once those elements sort of left my life, things started to, there was a clarity that entered, and then I started, just doing, more positive, what I perceive to be more positive things, right?
So from the outside, your life looked pretty perfect. You married your childhood sweetheart. You had 2 beautiful kids. You're playing with all these wonderful bands. But inside, you weren't doing very well and clearly not coping very well. So a lot of fighting in the marriage. Like, what happened?
Well, I think there was a lot of, for one thing, it wasn't necessarily high school sweetheart. It was extremely, good person, but we didn't know each other that well. And we started a family young, and I was sort of at the beginning of my career, but I'd already had a very established drinking problem. So that was the way I coped with my own insecurities and my own. I mean, the irony of it is that I didn't ever really like people staring at me all the time. Yet I found myself in a career where I was thrust in front of thousands of people on any given night. So I contended with that. I mean, like a lot of things, right? I mean, addicts are steeped in denial and avoidance, right? Like a lot of us are. I mean, there were only probably a handful of times that people externally said, I think you got a drinking problem, right? My ex probably, well, she was completely aware of it because when the kids were younger, I wasn't drinking as much at home, but certainly as they got older and certainly up and out, my issues got worse. But again, maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? And you live what you learn, and my dad, that's how he coped with his anxiety and stress and depression. And he was a highly regarded professional of, the psyche and psychiatric analysis and everything else, right? So as I say, just because, you do a certain job for what it is you do for a living doesn't necessarily equip you to deal with, your own, humanness, right? And so, I mean, one of the things that growing up with an alcoholic father, and an alcoholic father that was working in a field that was very sensitive to, if that was exposed, he'd lose credibility, he'd lose, he'd be stripped of almost everything, right? So there was a real underlying, unsaid reality of staying quiet. You couldn't really, say anything about the fact that your dad was, drinking all the time and, passing out drunk so, and subsequently, that's pretty much what I did and what I ultimately perpetrated on my children. For that, I'm eternally sorry for. But again, maladaptive coping mechanisms, you live what you learn, and I brought that into my relationship, and I think we can all relate to, there's a point where you in hindsight being 20/20, you look back and you go, yeah, that would have probably been the time to have really ended things. But it limped along for another half decade or however long. And finally, not unlike when I had to confront the fact that drinking was killing me, and I couldn't look the other way. I think that's what occurred in my marriage as well, that things had trust, the integrity of the relationship had been chipped away at so intensely that neither of us could look the other way. And it was just, it was, one of the reasons over the years that we stayed together when the kids were younger was for the kids. So, and I don't think that that's necessarily an uncommon scenario as far as I've seen. But it certainly was in our case. And then, again, you have busy lives, and certain things, certain aspects of communication, you just let it lapse, and a couple of days go by, and then a couple of weeks go by, and then a couple of months go by, and you realize that, the maladaptive coping mechanisms, as unsuccessful as they may be, they still are your coping mechanisms, and you cling to them like grim death because that's all you know, right? And sadly, the addiction of alcohol too, right? I mean, it's no way to solve things, because it's literally pushing things down. It's suppressing whatever the problem is, and the worst thing I find about drinking is that you're aware of the bad behavior, because we're all aware. I mean, and here's the reality: who in life hasn't done bad things? Really, we all have done bad things. But when you've had a few drinks, you just don't care as much about it. And you're not that concerned about the consequences of that bad behavior. And like I said, you drink to forget, only to be haunted by those actions the next day, right? And as I say, I mean, it chipped away at the integrity of the marriage and the relationship. And I mean, subsequently, another thing that is a common theme in alcoholic families is that the other spouse will drink more to contend with the over drinking of the primary alcoholic, right? And so I would have been the primary alcoholic, and subsequently my ex would have been drinking more to cope with the fact that, that was just what the environment had become. And then it spirals into uncertainty, poor communication, just not authentically relating to one another anymore. And here's the other thing too, is that we change. I mean, I hope in a year from now, you're going to be a remarkably different person. I hope you're going to be a different person. I know you will be. I know I will be. I mean, let's look at the last year, for God's sakes, right? It was only a year ago, March, that we literally said, oh, okay, so this is only going to be 4 or 6 weeks. 2 weeks, right? So, we are constantly changing. I mean, that's sort of the one constant as we go through life, is that it is change, right? And I think the biggest thing is to be aware of it. But the other thing about change is that it's scary, right? I mean, we gravitate towards the familiar for a very real reason, because we're more comfortable with it. And change is the unknown. Change is kind of chaos, right? And that's probably one of the things that has been so unnerving in this pandemic, is that we have been kind of thrust into a daily chaos, right? And we literally we're constant bombardment of this doom and gloom fear. Plus, there's a huge element of shame, and where you land on the spectrum of paranoia with the the virus, right? And the fact that it's constant. You want to talk about something that's changing. The virus is changing constantly, right? So it's very difficult. I think one thing I've learned is that we we're all thrown the same stimuli every day, but we're thrown a lot of stimuli every day. And what our brains try to do is we try to simplify things so we can actually sort of contend with it, right? Because if it's too complicated, if it's too much, then we get really frightened. And so what occurred in the marriage is that, all of the lack of communication, methods of coping had become just too chaotic. And eventually it just got to the point where it's like, okay, well, you know what? And that cliche, life is too short, memento mori, which is the Stoics say, you never know when you may leave this planet. And this pandemic has only expedited that notion because it's invisible. We don't know where we get it. We don't really know how we pass it or who, and it could take you out. So it's a relatively scary thing. point being, it brings you back to life is short. And one of the slogans I like about the in AA is live the day you're given. So if you find yourself in a marriage that is absolutely miserable, absolutely intolerable, this is it. This is our shot. So if it's unfixable, if you don't see any way, if there's sort of too much water that has gone under that bridge and it's gotten too murky and muddy, then often, and we now see that the stats I think are over 50% in terms of every marriage ends in divorce or separation. So clearly that model, and again I don't mean to be negative about it, but a friend of mine was talking to me a year or so ago before the pandemic, and he said that it would make more sense for us to have these sort of term contracts in relationships where every 5 years you reassess it, and if you've been exceptionally mean and unkind to that person and there's no justification, then reassess because the industry that flourishes from divorce and separation is lawyers, courts, all these, and sadly it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, right? The breakdown of the fundament. And here's the other thing too: when you got together with your mate, you didn't look at say his childish behavior as irresponsible and reckless. You looked at it as boyish and cute, right? And you didn't look in a male's case, you didn't look at your wife's provocative sexiness as slutty. It started out with the best of intentions, right? And sadly, as we change and life changes and things occur to us, we don't always move in the same direction, right? And the reason why we got together ultimately, whether it be a male-female or male-male or female-female, is that ideally two heads are better than one to contend with this journey, right? That's the ideal. But when things degenerate and break down, like they did, and alcohol is certainly addiction in that regard. I was killing myself, so at a certain point, I would assume she had to pull the parachute and say, "Okay, I got to cut and run because this situation is dying, if not dead." So I would say that would, as a long-winded answer, but yeah.
If she had ended things, I'm curious if she had ended things earlier and just said, "You know what, you're out, you either stop drinking or like I'm leaving you and I'm taking the kids." Do you think that would have caused you to turn things around at an earlier stage, or do you think that wouldn't have made any difference because you had to hit whatever was going to be your own bottom, and that sort of ultimatum wouldn't have made a difference?
2020, but in answer to your question, abstractly, I would say yes. Abstractly.
Yeah.
That's not what happened in reality. So all I can go by is how I reacted. And, is there regret? And absolutely. I think every alcoholic or everyone who has suffered immensely in their most primary relationship due to, and again, I'm not blaming alcohol entirely, but I am an alcoholic, and it is a disease. Like depression, like bipolarism, like any other sort of psychiatric, physiological that affects you physiologically, and affects your moods drastically. I would say theoretically, yes. I think that the outcome might have been different if the circumstances had been or gone that way. But in my case, they did not.
So I know in AA, I've been told that they teach you to make amends with those that you've hurt. in the past? Have you been able to make amends with your ex?
I have done. It's the fourth step, which is you make a list of all the people that you harmed, and you write out all of the things that occurred, and then the eighth step is actually going out and doing it. So I've gone through all the 12 steps, and I've done that, but I'm actually finding myself going through it again, and has it worked? It did with my ex-wife in terms of receptiveness. So I did an amends letter for my ex-wife, my daughter, and my son, and it worked 2 out of 3.
Okay.
And I guess, that's everyone heals, everyone sort of evolves in their own time and at their own pace. I mean, as alcoholics, we want, things to evolve at the pace we think it should. I mean, I think maybe all people do. And certainly millennials have grown up in an instant gratification world. So, yeah, that's how I'd respond to that question. It worked in 2 of the 3 cases, in my case. But it's something that I mean, that process I don't think is ever over. So, yeah.
Now, what advice do you have, if there's someone out there who's in a marriage and their spouse is abusing alcohol, and they have children together, having gone through your own journey, what advice do you have for somebody who's in that situation as to how to deal with it?
Not so much for giving advice, but observation of if I was looking at a younger me, I'd give them a shake and slap them upside the head. No, I would. I'd really try to impress upon the individual who's in, because I have, one of the things that you do in AA is that you sponsor people, right? And for instance, I have a sponsor in AA. You sponsor people, and what that essentially means is you're looking for someone who has, say, more sobriety than you do, and who has gone through some of the process of getting sober. So my advice to the problematic drinker would be, if things are starting to disintegrate in the relationship, or there's, I thankfully never had any DUIs, I thankfully never was thrown in jail, the drunk tank, or any of these things, but I've heard of situations, all those scenarios occurring, and still the person didn't wise up. And if any of these things were happening, or just the fact, quite simply, the other spouse in the relationship was just exasperated and saying, you know what, I'm at my wit's end, your drinking is out of control, because drinking really, when you're drinking to either contend with the harshness of reality, or the harshness of not being able to relate to your spouse, it will eventually, I mean, that mountain of unresolved issues keeps building and building and building till basically, I mean, I like to think of it, there's a great analogy of the late day shadow. The further you get away from your problems, the bigger it becomes. And the closer you get to it, you right size that problem, right? You can actually look at it. So drinking is essentially camouflaging any of the issues you may have in your life. And if it's connecting with your spouse, if it's relating with your kids, it'll only delay the reality of that. It's literally, what I would say is if you're having a problem with your relationship, try not drinking for a day. Because if you can make it through one day, you can make it through 2 days, and the clarity that comes with that, and I can only say it's a chemical reaction. What occurs in our brain when alcohol hits our system, and that first drink sort of relaxes you, and then that second drink takes it even further, and by drink 3 or 4, then you're just basically wasted, and you're on your way to complete, denial and suppression of whatever it is you're dealing with. And the sad reality of alcohol is that it makes us humans violent. And I would say 95, if not more percent of all domestic violence involves alcohol. So I would also say that take a good hard look at if that's occurring, and whether it's not necessarily physical violence, but it's hostility by screaming, not being able to rationally have a conversation. Irrationality explodes when people drink. And that's what I would say to someone if they're having issues, problems in their life period, but in the primary relationship, because that's the person that you ideally are hoping to build a life. And the ideal is to, the Catholic Christian ideal is till death do you part. If you mix, from my observation in my situation in life, you're not dealing with reality. You're literally couching reality, and it will come back. Like reality, here's another thing I always like to say. It's like when you've got a plastic ruler in your mouth and you're bending it. Eventually it's going to slap back and hit you in the face. And that's what you're doing when you're not contending with your problems in your marriage, your problems with your children. Because we're also, we're today contending with a lot of behavioral issues with our children in the last decade, much greater than 30 years ago. A higher incidence of autism, higher incidence of the way kids are coping with their own depression and their own self-esteem. We have so we're in a pandemic, but we have a massive epidemic of mental unwellness today in our culture, as far as I can see. And that our culture is basically a culmination of our relationships. And if our relationships are relying on artificial stimulants to get you through, what will be produced as an artificial result and an artificial solve in any relationship ultimately, right?
Well, there's so much to say on this topic. Our show's not that long, and you did bring a treat, and you brought your guitar.
I did.
And you're going to play a new song for our listeners.
Sure.
So,
all right.
What's the song called?
It's called Pretty Mess.
Pretty Mess.
And it's actually, the phrase is, you're pretty messed. So, here it is. Don't go so late. By the expression on my face, my whole world changed. But I'm glad you're here with what's his head, 'cause I'll exercise restraint. You're all the things you ain't. You're hypnotized, there's no surprise. Good luck with that. I must confess, you're such a pretty mess. Empty promises and heartache. A girl in distress, I must confess. You're such a pretty mess. We hit the wall, a stupid call, P.S. You're pretty mess. Before I met you, my world was dry like toast. A hard luck trading post. Happy maiden folks, they left me. What was I thinking? Inflicted so much pain. Now you're gone and I've moved on. Good luck with that game. I must confess, you're such a pretty mess. Empty promises and heartache. A girl in distress, I must confess. You're such a pretty mess. We hit the wall, a stupid call, P.S. You hit the wall, a stupid call. You're a pretty mess. Pretty mess.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
You're welcome.
I love it.
Love it.
Well, thanks for having me, girls.
When will that song be coming out?
Actually, my girlfriend produced a video for it that we just released not long ago. on YouTube, and we're going to be releasing it on Spotify and DistroKid, and in 4 weeks.
Well, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
That's amazing.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you
So
so
again,
much.
Rob Laidlaw, Leanne Townsend, and I really are happy that you were able to join us. I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And I'm Leanne Townsend. Thank you for tuning in to our listeners, and we'll see you next time.